Hamas has called Donald Trump a racist, a recipe for chaos, and a man with absurd ideas for Gaza. But after an unusual phone call last month, Hamas has come to believe that the US president can be trusted. Reuters reported, citing 5 Palestinian sources, 3 of whom are Hamas. The story goes that after a meeting at the White House, Trump had forced Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to speak to the Qatari Prime Minister, who had apologized for the Israeli attack on a Hamas political compound in Doha. The bombing in Qatar did not kill Hamas leaders, including chief negotiator Khalil al-Hayya. Trump's handling of the situation has given Hamas confidence in him, believing that he can stand up to Netanyahu and is serious about ending the war in Gaza. Now, Hamas, which signed a Trump-brokered ceasefire on October 8th, has once again taken the man's word, even though he has proposed ousting the Palestinians from Gaza this year and turning it into a US-controlled seaside resort. Under the deal, which went into effect yesterday, October 10th, Hamas has agreed to release the hostages without any guarantees of a full Israeli withdrawal. 2 other Palestinian sources said it was a big risk and they were hoping that Trump, who had been so keen on the deal, would not let it go. Hamas leaders are well aware that this risk could backfire. One of the sources said, they fear that Israel could resume military operations after the hostages are released, as it did after the January ceasefire, in which the Trump team was also heavily involved. But Hamas representatives gathered on the Red Sea coast of Sharm el-Sheikh for indirect talks with Israel, seeing the presence of Trump's close associates and influential Arab mediators in the region, and signed a ceasefire despite many of their demands remaining unresolved, including the issue of a Palestinian state. Trump's active involvement was clearly felt, said one Hamas official who attended the event. A senior US official confirmed that Trump personally made 3 phone calls during the marathon talks. His son-in-law Jared Kushner and aide Steve Witkoff were also involved in the Israeli and Qatari delegations. No guarantees for next steps. While it may pave the way for an end to the war, there is no guarantee that the next steps outlined in Trump's 20-point Gaza plan will be implemented. But Trump's handling of both the Qatar strikes and the ceasefire that ended a 12-day war between Israel and Iran in June gave the Hamas delegation confidence that the US president would not allow Israel to resume the war once the hostages were released. According to a source familiar with the situation in Washington, Trump's aides saw the Qatar strikes as an opportunity to use his anger at Netanyahu to pressure him to end the Gaza war. A senior White House official said that Trump, who has cultivated ties with Gulf states that are important to his broader foreign and economic interests, considers the Qatari emir a personal friend and was upset to see images of the strikes on television. He called the strike a major turning point that led to Arab world unity. A Palestinian official familiar with the Gaza negotiations and mediation process said Trump's public pledge that such Israeli attacks on Qatar would not be repeated had boosted his credibility with Hamas and other regional actors. The fact that he gave Qatar security guarantees that Israel would not attack them again has given Hamas more confidence in the ceasefire, said Jonathan Reinhold, a political scientist at Bar-Ilan University in Israel. According to a Palestinian source in Gaza, Hamas also took note of Trump's explicit order to Iran and Israel to stop fighting. He particularly noted the demand in Truth Social, published hours after Trump announced his plan to bomb Iran, that the Israeli planes should turn back and go home. He does what he says, even though he makes a show of it. This has shown that he can force Israel to respect the ceasefire, the source said. October negotiations were at a standstill. Trump announced his general plan on September 29th, during Netanyahu's visit to the White House, and Hamas gave it conditional approval 4 days later, which the U.S. president took as a green light. However, by October 7th of this year, the talks were already at a standstill over how to implement the plan. According to a source familiar with the negotiations, the dispute mainly centered on how quickly and to what extent Israeli forces should withdraw from Gaza. This was necessary to give Hamas the opportunity to round up and release the hostages. Mediators from Qatar, Egypt, and Turkey were unable to move the process forward. Qatari Prime Minister Sheikh Mohammed bin Abdulrahman Al Thani decided to travel to Sharm el-Sheikh in person on October 7th to resolve the issue. Meanwhile, Witkoff and Kushner arrived in the early hours of October 8th, and the talks began around noon. The presence of Ibrahim Kalin, the intelligence chief of NATO member Turkey, was also important because Ankara has strong ties to Hamas. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan said during a recent meeting with Trump that the U.S. leader had asked him for help in convincing Hamas to accept the plan. For 2 years, Hamas has demanded that the hostages be released only if Israel withdraws completely and ends the war. Israel has insisted that the war will end only when all the hostages are returned and Hamas is destroyed. Neither side has been able to fully implement its terms. Israel will remain in half of Gaza for now, while Hamas will remain an organization, a key requirement in the Trump plan. Hamas's disarmament has been postponed to a later stage. But this very situation, the fact that both sides are once again looking for a result, could serve to move the next round of talks forward, said one of the sources familiar with the process. A key moment in the talks, according to a senior U.S. official and a Palestinian official in Gaza, was that the mediators were able to convince Hamas that holding the hostages was no longer its power but its duty. Hamas has concluded that holding the hostages is working against the Palestinians' interests and that, without them, Israel would have no basis for restarting the war. However, the group has not received any written guarantees, meaning there are no clear mechanisms to ensure that the first phase, the release of the hostages, a partial withdrawal of Israeli forces, and a cessation of hostilities, will lead to a deal that would end the full-scale war. Hamas is relying only on verbal assurances from the United States and its intermediary states, Egypt, Qatar, and Turkey. Trump will see this deal through to the end, and once the hostages are released, he will not allow Israel to restart the war. For us, this deal will end the war, said a Hamas official. A risky move could backfire. Hamas leaders are well aware that their risky gamble could backfire. Despite a plan to gradually release hostages and withdraw Israeli forces after a ceasefire in January, Trump abruptly announced in the middle of the process that he would cancel the deal and open the gates of hell if Hamas did not release all prisoners at once. A few weeks later, the deal collapsed and the war flared up again. According to Gaza health authorities, More than 16,000 Palestinians have died as a result. Israel has imposed an aid embargo, and the World Hunger Monitor has declared a famine in the enclave. As one regional diplomat put it, if Hamas or its allies take aggressive action, such as rocket attacks on Israel, Israel could be tempted to take advantage of the situation and continue to strike the group. However, this time it felt different from the previous ceasefire, said one Hamas official. He said the Israelis were serious about the deal this time, and Egypt, Qatar, Turkey and the Americans were putting pressure on both sides, and it was starting to pay off. A source familiar with the talk said, Trump's victory tour of the Middle East starting on October 12th would also help to keep the deal alive, even if there are still tough issues to be resolved. Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi's offer to Trump was described as a very smart move.